So let's see how CAT 2022 went in the first slot, the morning slot. And as people would have expected, CAT did turn up with a few surprises this year. What were the surprises? If you look at your overall structure, you observe that this does not change. The number of questions overall, 66 questions, remained constant. The sectional breakup remained constant at 24, 20, 22. But if you notice, there is this point here where you observe that your number of theta questions in verbal went down from 5 that you had in CAT 21-20 to 3. So obviously there was a change here. Okay. Then what about the other change? This came in the DILR section, but this was a slightly more internal change that is based on the distribution of the questions there. Okay, let's look at each section. When we consider the verbal section here, we observe that the distribution in terms of RC versus VA was constant at 16 versus 8. Also, the RCs did maintain most of the characteristics that we could consider typical to CAT. For example, having RCs with 400 to 600 odd words, the RCs being readable in nature. I would call them slightly dense compared to last year for one or two passages. For example, this one on economics and politics, which had some reference to Karl Marx, was a slightly tougher one. But again, this was the only one which could have been really considered on the tougher side. The others, the one on Oriental versus Western views, the one on supernatural beings, all of these were quite readable in that sense. Having said that, the questions were definitely inferential with a couple of new question types thrown in. When I say new question types thrown in, what do I mean here? What happened was the question would be something like this. Which of the following statements, if false, would contradict the author? So you have to read the statement, then assume the negation of that statement, and then decide whether it contradicts the author's view or supports the author's view. So there were a few questions of this type, and a lot of such questions were framed in such a manner that you have to understand first as to what do they want. But on the whole, this was something that was eminently doable. 2 to 2.5 RCs could have been tackled. Now coming to the verbal part, 2 out of 3 question types remained more or less constant. The para summaries were the typical CAT para summaries, a relatively dense passage or a relatively short readable passage with very short para summaries. So that remained more or less constant. I would rate this as moderate. I didn't find any of the para summary questions very tough. Similarly, para jumbles were quite readable. They were also on the easier side. Maybe one of them was moderate, but definitely doable. Lastly, coming to paragraph completion. Now this was a new question type that replaced the out of context or odd man out statements. Now also one important thing that happened which might affect the sectional cutoff for the verbal ability section is that 2 theta questions got replaced by 2 MCQs. So the para completion had a passage given to us with 4 places where a blank was mentioned. Blank number 1, blank number 2, 3 and 4. And then you had one sentence which could best fit into one of these 4 blanks. So you had to take that sentence and figure out which was the best place where it fit. So in a way you had to treat it like a combination of a comprehension question to understand the passage, a para jumble question to understand where does it link with the previous and subsequent statements, and a para completion statement. So from a surprise point of view, they could be considered tough, but yes, standalone basis, these were quite doable. On the whole, when we consider the verbal section, I would say that most students would have been in a position to attempt anywhere around 8 to 9 questions. And here, when I say 8 to 9 questions, these are serious attempts with an expected accuracy of around 85 to 90%. So 2 RCs plus 3 to 4 verbal questions done well could have been good to get you close to a 99 percentile. So I would say anywhere around 13 to 14 questions here, or 12 to 14 with a good accuracy could be good enough for a 99 percentile. Coming to the second and possibly the toughest section here, which was data interpretation. Here I felt that all 4 questions had some amount of focus on mathematical reasoning. 2 sets, where you look at this slide, you will see that 2 sets had distribution of certain values. So one, for example, had a total number of entities to be divided among a certain number of games, for example, and then you had to distribute it as per certain rules. I possibly found this to be the easiest of the 4 sets and was able to get all the answers in a relatively short amount of time. But the other set, which was about how certain people, some 5-6 people, distributed tokens to some 5-6 people, was definitely on the tougher side. You initially started off with a certain assumption and then found that it actually ended up getting tougher and tougher. It also uses some aspect of number theory, in the sense that you had to use concepts of prime factors to be able to solve this. So maybe with a bit of logical application you could have solved 1 or 2 questions here, but this was definitely on the tougher side. Then there was a set on Venn diagrams, as expected, a 3 set Venn with other, with a couple of other parameters thrown in, but could have been tackled with a lot of patience. It required good question selection here. The last set, the one on critical path. Now this was on one where you had a figure based on certain train routes, and this looked like the most doable initially. But then once you started going into it, you realized that it was far tougher than you thought. So on the whole, this section had a lot of traps that you needed to be careful about. And one common occurrence that would happen with most students is, you start the set, you are able to solve 2 to 3 questions, and then you get stuck. Okay, there is one more interesting thing that you can observe here, and this is this. Last year we still had 4 sets, but the distribution was 6, 6, 4, 4. That is 2 relatively tougher sets with 6 questions each, 2 moderate sets with 4 questions, or moderate to tough sets with 4 questions. Here everything went out to 5 questions. So this in a way evened out the scales in favor or against the relative sets here. In terms of attempts, I would say that if you were able to attempt anywhere around 10 to 11 questions well, then you should be very confident of getting a 99 plus percentile. But even attempting roughly 1.5 to 2 sets, that is 7 to 8 questions, should be able to put you in a good position to get a 95 plus percentile. Coming to the last section, quant. Now I would say that this was a bit of a mixed bag of section, in the sense that for example, if you see, your geometry questions were quite easy. Your arithmetic questions, though they were structured and framed in a slightly complex manner in 1 or 2 cases, these were also quite easy. So if your question selection was right, then you could have easily tackled anywhere between 9 to 11 questions just from these 2 areas. Then yes, when you come to algebra, numbers and modern math, you found another 11 questions between these 3, and these comprise the slightly tougher questions. Not to say that all of them were tough, but yes, it did require a lot of conceptual clarity here. So there were concepts tested like nature of a quadratic equation in terms of the graphical form, a couple of questions on modulus, questions on maxima minima. However, a lot of these could be tackled if you use the options wisely. So here, for this section especially, your question selection was the key. If you were able to select the right questions from arithmetic and geometry, you could have gone up to 15 to 16 attempts easily. And crossing 16 good attempts would clearly have taken you very close to a 99 percentile. So overall, if we look at this particular slot, I would rate it as a moderate slot. I would say almost at par with last year in terms of difficulty. However, the corresponding scores for this year might fall by 2-3 marks simply because the structure of the verbal section changed in terms of the breakup between MCQ and theta. But I wouldn't say that it would be a drastic difference. So on the whole, if I were to look at the number of good attempts, I would say that anywhere around say 14 verbal or 13 verbal, 10 DILR and 15 quant would bring you to around 38-39 attempts. If you take an 80-85 percentile year, okay, then you end up with roughly around 31 correct questions and 7 to 8 wrong answers. So I think that kind of a score, 31 correct and 7 to 8 wrong would lead you to a score of around 85, which would be equivalent to a 95 odd percentile. But if you were to go to a 99 plus, you would have needed around 41-42 attempts with a higher accuracy, 85 to 90 percentile. But definitely I would say at par more or less with last year. So nothing major to worry. For slot 2 and slot 3, I would say just go on with your preparation, go in with an open mind and do not worry about the changes in the section. Thank you.